Is your podcast getting listeners but not turning into clients? There's a good chance that it's not your content. It's what you can't see. So I'm hosting a free podcast growth audit workshop where I'm breaking down the invisible gaps that are quietly costing you listeners, leads, and sales, and how to fix them without doing more. This is for you if your downloads feel inconsistent, you're not getting inquiries from your podcast, or you know that something's off, but you can't pinpoint exactly what that is. And yes, I will also show you how to audit your own show, or you can get direct feedback from me. You can grab your free spot by going to podcastingformoms.co/workshop. Once again, that is podcastingformoms.co/workshop. Because your podcast shouldn't just take time, it should make you money. Let me tell you something that most new podcasters don't want to hear. Your podcast doesn't fail because of your microphone. And it doesn't fail because you didn't have the perfect cover art. And it definitely doesn't fail because you didn't post enough on Instagram. Most podcasts fail because the hosts focus on the wrong things during their first 90 days. They spent weeks obsessing over tiny details while completely ignoring the handful of things that actually move the needle. So if you're launching a podcast or you've recently launched and you're wondering why things feel slow, this episode's going to change the way that you think about your first 3 months behind the mic. Because today we're going to be talking about something that I call the minimum viable podcast and what actually matters during your first 90 days. Welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the show for moms in business ready to start, grow, and scale a podcast that turns their listeners into buyers. I'm Jenny Sonesson, a podcast strategist and fellow mom entrepreneur. You're in the right place if you want to learn how to start and grow a podcast that attracts your ideal clients and really does the heavy lifting for you when it comes to selling your offers, all while balancing life as a busy mom. Are you ready to create a podcast that grows your income, impact, and influence? Let's make podcasting work for you, because as moms, we know how to get things done. All right, let's jump into the episode. Hey, and welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the podcast for mom entrepreneurs who want to start, grow, and scale a podcast that actually supports their business. Around here, we talk about podcast strategy, visibility, and building a show that works for your business instead of becoming another thing on your already very full to-do list. Because as moms building businesses, we don't have unlimited time to experiment with strategies that may or may not work. We need simple, we need sustainable, and we need a podcast that actually moves our business forward. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. So let's get into it. So when most people start a podcast, they think that the goal is perfection. Perfect branding, perfect audio quality, perfect episode structure, and perfect editing. But the truth is, perfection is not what builds momentum. Consistency and clarity build momentum. And the faster that you can get to those two things, the faster your podcast starts working for you. And that's why I teach something called the minimum viable podcast. It's the simplest version of your podcast that still does the job that it's supposed to do. Not fancy, not complicated, just effective. Because the first 90 days of your podcast are not about perfection. They're about proof of concept and momentum. So what does a minimum viable podcast actually mean? So a minimum viable podcast means that you're focusing on the core elements that actually matter and ignoring everything else for now. You're not trying to build the final version of a podcast. You're building version 1. Because the truth is, your podcast will evolve, your content will evolve, your voice will evolve, and your audience will evolve. And if you wait until everything feels perfect before starting, you're never going to start. So let's talk about the handful of things that actually matter during your first 3 months as a podcaster. Not the 17 different things that the internet tells you to worry about, just the essentials. So the first thing is clarity of purpose. So before anything else, your podcast needs a clear purpose, not just I want to start a podcast, but what role does this podcast play in my business? Is it meant to attract new leads, build authority in your niche, nurture potential clients, support your offers, or create long-form content that you can repurpose? Your podcast doesn't exist in isolation. It should be part of your content ecosystem. And when your podcast has a clear purpose, every episode becomes easier to plan. And more importantly, it becomes easier for listeners to understand why they should keep coming back for more. The second thing is a simple, sustainable content plan. So you want to have a content plan that you can realistically stick to. And this is where a lot of podcasters burn themselves out. They start with huge ambitions, weekly interviews, solo episodes, bonus episodes, maybe even a video version. And within a few months, they are completely overwhelmed. Instead, your minimum viable podcast should answer one simple question. What can I realistically sustain? Maybe that's one solo episode per week or 2 episodes per month or maybe a seasonal format. Consistency is more important than frequency. A podcast that runs consistently for a year will always outperform a podcast that launches big and then disappears 6 months later. The third thing is messaging that speaks to one specific listener. I want you to know your podcast is not for everyone, and that is a good thing. The fastest growing podcasts speak directly to one type of listener with one type of problem. So for example, if your audience is mom entrepreneurs trying to build a business with limited time, then your podcast messaging should constantly speak to that reality, their goals, their constraints, their struggles. Because when your listener feels like you're talking directly to them, they're going to stick around and then they're going to tell other people about your show. The fourth thing is momentum over metrics. This one might surprise you. During your first 90 days, your downloads honestly don't matter that much. Yes, of course, it's nice to see the numbers go up, but early on, your biggest goal here is going to be momentum. Momentum looks like publishing consistently, getting comfortable speaking behind the mic, learning what topics resonate, and improving your delivery. Your first episodes are not meant to be perfect. They're meant to get you into the rhythm of podcasting. And the fifth and final thing is visibility outside the podcast app. So here is something most people overlook. Yes, you can get discovered via podcast apps if you have implemented SEO. However, you do need to have some visibility outside of the podcast app. Things like podcast guesting, email marketing, blog posts, collaborations, and sharing episodes directly with your audience. The podcasts who grow the fastest are the ones who understand this early on. They don't just publish episodes and hope people come. They actively put their podcast in front of new audiences. And this could also be with podcast SEO as well, but a lot of people overlook that as well. And they're not optimizing their show for search engines, so they're not getting new listeners. So you may be wondering, cool, that's great. Now I know what I need to worry about. But what do I not need to worry about yet? So let's talk about what doesn't matter during your first 90 days, because that is where most podcasters get stuck. You don't need perfect editing or a $500 microphone or fancy intros and outros or a huge launch strategy or a complicated production workflow. All you need is a clear message, a sustainable plan, a decent under $100 microphone called the Samson Q2U, and the willingness to keep showing up. That's it. Your first 3 months of podcasting are about one thing and one thing only, and that is building the habit of showing up behind the mic. Because once that habit is established, everything else gets easier. Your confidence grows, your voice becomes clearer, your content becomes sharper, and your podcast starts becoming one of the most powerful marketing assets in your business. So if you're in the early stages of podcasting, I want you to take a deep breath. You don't need to do everything perfectly. You just need to start building momentum. Focus on the minimum viable podcast. Keep it simple, keep it strategic, and most importantly, keep going. The podcasters who succeed are not the ones who start perfectly. They're the ones who stay consistent long enough to figure it out. And if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking, okay, but I'd really love someone to actually look at my podcast and tell me what's working and what's not. That's exactly what my podcast growth audit workshop is designed to help you do. Inside the workshop, I'm going to walk you through the exact framework I use to evaluate podcasts so you can identify what's holding your show back and where to focus next. You can sign up by going to podcastingformoms.co/workshop or via the link in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean the world if you took a second to follow the show or share this episode with another mom who's building something behind the mic. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you next time on Podcasting for Moms. Thank you for tuning into Podcasting for Moms. I hope today's episode gave you the tools and inspiration you need to make your podcast work smarter, not harder. If you love what you heard, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It means the world and helps other moms in business find the show. For more tips, resources, and support, head to podcastingformoms.co. Remember, you're not just building a podcast, you're building your legacy. Until next time, friends.